Hello and welcome to the Season 2 debut of Plants to Plants Hemp Processing Seminars by Sci-Fi Systems. Sci-Fi Systems brings industrial extraction and processing technology into the future, and Plants to Plants brings top-tier experts to the table to inform viewers about what it really takes to go from concept to completion on a processing plant or extraction lab. I would like to remind all viewers to ask questions during today's session using the Q&A module or the chat feature. Today's episode is Don't Fear the FDA, cGMP Compliant Facilities Planning with Andrew Samann. As the federal government moves closer to formalizing regulations for cannabinoid ingredients manufacturing, one thing has become perfectly evident. The FDA will require GMP compliance for all hemp ingredient processing facilities. In this opening discussion session of Plants to Plants Season 2, we uncover what it takes to make your facility compliant for today and tomorrow. We will touch on cleaning and sanitation, critical control points, how raw materials, equipment, and processing relate to GMP compliance, and much, much more. Our guest this week is Andrew Samann. Andrew is the founder, principal consultant, and CEO of cannabis consultancy Orion GMP Solutions. After serving in the United States Marine Corps, his first contact with the cannabis industry came in 2006 as a medical cannabis patient. He went on to get a degree in biochemistry and started moonlighting in the cannabis industry while working as a lab scientist in the pharmaceutical sector. In 2015, he made the switch to become a full-time consultant to the cannabis industry. 5 years on, Andrew has helped over 100 companies apply quality by design principles to develop good manufacturing practices, facilities, and quality management systems, and he holds multiple chair positions between ASTM D37 Cannabis Standards Committee and the Emerald Science Conference. As always, this discussion is hosted and moderated by the Sci-Fi Systems CEO. Once again, I would like to encourage all our viewers and visitors to ask questions during today's session. At the end, we will have time to talk over them. They can be specific to your business. They can be really about anything dealing with the subject matter. After the episode, if you like the content, please go have a look at our prior interviews, panels, and discussions from Plants to Plants Season 1, episodes 1 through 8. They're all on our website at sciphysystems.com. That's SCIPHY systems.com. Now, without further ado, I will start to bring up our guest and our host, and we can get moving on to the episode.
All right. Thank you, Edwin, for the introduction. As always, very excited to launch Season 2 of Plants to Plants. And what an appropriate time to open up with GMP. Everybody's sort of on the tips of their toes and got their ears perked up about what the FDA is going to do, what they're going to do to regulate the hemp industry. Andrew, why don't we start off with a little bit more background on just what is a GMP, what is a GMP consultancy, how do you help companies out there in space?
Absolutely, and thank you for the opportunity, Emmett and Edwin. So what is GMP? Good manufacturing practices. It's basically any company's systems that they use to manufacture a product, and it's meeting specifications all the way along the production pathway. It's the ability to measure everything that is critical to the quality of the product, and then demonstrating that the product wasn't adulterated, there were no product mix-ups, and that the label is accurate to what it should be, or what it was labeled as. So that's GMP in a one-sentence elevator pitch.
All right, great. And you know, it's important to understand that those sort of practical breadth of GMP, that it's not just equipment, it's not just practices, it's not just, you know, wearing the right protective equipment for your workers or workforce policies. It's really the full process set, the full procedure set, and also the planning of your facility to be able to meet the requirements that the FDA and other regulatory bodies have set for food safety and traceability in manufacturing of products used by humanity. And let's maybe start with a basic question. I think that a lot of people are going to struggle to understand, and it's going to be really crucial for this FDA ruling. And that is, you know, the difference between just sort of GMP and then this cGMP moniker, and specifically, I think for our purposes, what is 21 CFR 111, which designates cGMP for nutritional supplements. That's something we might see in the hemp industry shortly as being CBD or hemp extract generally being treated not as a food ingredient, but as a nutritional supplement ingredient. So what can you tell us about the difference between those two regulatory systems?
So GMP you can think of as the guidelines that the FDA or the EU or TGA in Australia or almost anywhere, those are the documents that you want to follow. When you have a corresponding set of documents where you can put the check in the box for each one of the federal GMP requirements, you're essentially making a claim that you're keeping your own business current with what practices are required to make a safe and reliable product. So it's not as though there's a difference between the two. It's like one is a national code, the other is the implementation in the organization, and then being able to demonstrate it to an auditor. So it's more simple than you might think.
Sure. So would you say then that the actual guidelines for between a food facility and between a nutritional supplement facility are actually equivalent, but it's just the rigor with which you're checked on those rules and regulations that changes?
Right. Please ask the questions that give away the secrets. What difference can you have between a cleanable food facility and, let's take it up a notch, to a pharmaceutical facility? There are only so many different types of materials you can purchase that are smooth and cleanable. So to transition from food GMP to dietary supplement is not impossible, but you do have to take into consideration how a process may be cleaned or sanitized and then demonstrate that it was adequately cleaned. So when you think of a physical structure that surrounds a process, you have biomass going in and then it's extracted and then the downstream steps happen. The most important question we have to ask is it a food product at the end of the day that it's going into? So are you making a food ingredient, or are you making a dietary supplement ingredient, or outright a dietary supplement product? In those cases, you would increase the complexity in regulations, but the similarities throughout GMP guidelines are so apparent that once you meet the basic requirements of food, it becomes much more easy to graduate up from there. And you'll also see that there are some systems that are absent in dietary that are present in food. And most often what we recommend is that a manufacturer does combined compliance of Part 117, FSMA, and then Part 111, because the components of 111 are actually covered in 117, minus for allergens. So if one were to produce what could arguably be a cannabis food or a hemp product food or a hemp dietary supplement, we would just be controlling some aspects of what allergens go into the product for the first case, and then possibly even the second case, depending on what products come out the door. So when we look at GMP and what's applicable, we ask the question first of what's the dose form going into the human, and how do we know that that is adequately controlled throughout the entire production process?
Great. Well, so that can be a relief to a lot of folks that may have built their facilities to food GMP standards and are worried, oh, these regulatory changes are coming down the pipeline. I'm going to have to rebuild my facility or something like that. Now, so that's unlikely. However, that said, making the graduation up to the cGMP nutritional supplement standards, it is a level of additional scrutiny. So maybe if you fudged it a little bit, or you weren't as into the details when you first brought in GMP into your facility, now would be the time to start looking over those details again and seeing if you can improve your internal standards, right?
Right. I think that it's difficult to just say, hey, this food facility will meet dietary supplement requirements or GMP requirements, and it'll be the small nuances that catch people. For example, one that I had caught on an audit in an FDA registered facility was that there were dead legs in the system, or the water system, that literally introduced water into the production process. Now, a dead leg, for those that aren't familiar with the terminology, is when you have a water pipe that leads to an end. and this would be an example of one. But when you have a looped system that water is continuously flowing in, you won't go to the end of this spigot, draw it out, and then see microbial contamination in it. If there's no water flowing through that pipe, then you have a different story. You could sample that and say, well, this is microbial contamination that's going into the next batch of the product. So it's really looking for the risks in the process, and how if water was a critical material going into the product or into the substance, you would want to have that system qualified and ask some of those questions of, is there a risk with a dead leg that leads out to the next batch? And then the answer to this also is, how big is the risk? Do you need to actually change that system? Because I can go in as an auditor and say, oh, you've got dead legs, and someone might take that very seriously. But the good quality assurance manager is going to say, I think that we can solve this problem with increased testing and verifying whether or not there's some type of pathogen that's harbored in our watering system. So those are where there are workarounds, but in many cases, if you identify something that's a risk, then you can develop an adequate control to implement it. And the scary part to me is that there are a lot of businesses, you know, in being a small business owner myself, like I look at what the expenses are, what are the fixed costs, what are the operational expenses. And if you have fixed costs that, you know, add another $1 million to your facility, that's a significant amount of product that needs to be manufactured to get a return on the investment. So, you know, it's really just something to be cautious of, not just to take something as gospel, and really think through the problems. And without carrying on too long for answering the question, one of the best examples that I had seen of this was with this gentleman I had met in Oakland, California. And it was while we were doing some work with equity applicants there. And his position was that the FDA will in fact say you have extreme requirements to meet GMP, but he made it his personal agenda to make the world's smallest cannery that could be FDA registered. And this is the important point, though, not that these regulations would become a barrier to entry, but rather it would be accessible to any business, and that even the smallest business, like let's say it's only producing a liter of crude extract a day, that they would still be able to participate in the economy. Otherwise, it's just the cards would be stacked against people. I just think that people get scared away from GMP because they don't understand that smallest version case. So it's very important to not just assume, oh, we can't become GMP compliant. It's just a matter of applying the systems, if you will.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I hesitate to stop here and divert the conversation, because there's so much to go into there about understanding, you know, that it's a match of practices with the physical infrastructure, right? And so
right.
for every problem, there might appear to be a physical infrastructure problem. There's a potential practices and policy change, internal SOP change that can be made to adjust for that. But yes, that said, I know that a lot of people listening in and watching this video on YouTube or here on Zoom are thinking about the changes coming down the pipeline. So I do want to put that at the top. You know, what do you see coming down the pipeline? Do you have any crystal ball forecasting of what the FDA might be doing and how that might match up also with international regulations? I know you've worked with international FDA regulations outside the US as well.
Completely. I think the most indicative story from the FDA these days is their critical review of CBD and looking for contractors to evaluate its quality across the board. In my opinion, seeing that, the FDA is first approaching it from a critical quality attribute perspective and a safety perspective. So without understanding what the products are, the FDA would be going in blind. And this is where we should all thank them for doing their job well and not hindering business. And this is my speculation, it's that they're going to model what quality means for each dose form, how it goes in or on the human. And then they're going to identify where there, in fact, may be safety attributes or critical safety attributes, as we call them, that could be harmful to public health. And especially at a large scale, if we adopt these products, we have to know as a nation, internationally, humans consuming this in general, we have to know what the product is. So once they go about assessing the quality and are able to report on that adequately, I think that they'll be able to provide more informed guidance. The difficulty that I think the FDA faces is that the hemp industry and hemp products or hemp flower derived products don't fit neatly into categories yet. Like we know, the only categorization that I can say is how does it go on or in the human, and figure out where the safety risks are from there. And I know this isn't like the direct answer of what are they going to say about facilities. Well, this is how they're going to define their answers on facilities. And it might be that you're okay with, loading in biomass on the front end of a warehouse into an extractor with stuff that's been outside, like raw materials have been outside, and then you transform that into a cleaner product. For an extreme case, I audited a facility that was producing active pharmaceutical ingredients, and their entire not their extraction operation, but their entire reaction vessel and systems that were associated with it were outdoors. And then the product was pumped indoors into a clean environment, or rather, I'll say the intermediate substance was pumped in there. So it can go any which way. The important point is that the FDA will look at what your unit operations are. You're loading biomass, then you have a crude extraction, and then maybe further refinement. As you go down that pathway and you look through your block flow diagrams and say, step 1, load biomass. Step 2, ensure that extractor is sufficiently packed. Step 3, that everything went according to our standard operating procedure and batch record requirements. Was it within range? Those are all the things that people need to be able to speak to. So for those that are looking to anticipate where the FDA is going, it's more like, how do you organize your systems in a fashion that are transparent to them? Not so much of what exactly do we need to physically change. And you can, hire anyone to come in and say, oh yeah, we'll make this a smooth, cleanable surface, but you got to ask, why does it need to be a clean and smooth, or smooth and cleanable surface? My favorite quality mentor that I never met is Edwards Deming. And he has this video interview. He's like the quality guru that literally taught the Japanese quality. And in this interview, he says, well, look at this table here. If we were to ask ourselves, is it clean enough to eat dinner on? Yes, absolutely. But if you're going to manufacture something on top of this table, it may not be clean enough. So it's more like right now, if anyone's concerned about how they approach future FDA compliance, yes, there are physical requirements, but those are so transparent it's not even funny. It's showing that you have control over your process that really is necessary. And showing, even if you have something that's wrong, if there's something flawed with the facility and there's a leak over an extraction system or something else that's critical, well, okay, fire up your quality management system, document the deviation from facility specifications, write up a plan of how you're going to fix it, estimate the cost, and set a timeline to actually adequately fixing it. It might be that you don't have to construct $1 million box around the process, and you can put a plexiglass box over it, and it accomplishes the same goal. So that's really the approach we take of know your process, and then define where it might go sideways and what the risks are, and then define what the risk controls will be. And you know this as well. There are some things with extraction, they go sideways. Well, okay, new opportunity for improvement. So it's really just a system that allows for continuous updating and being transparent of where you're going wrong and then fixing it. So
that's the biggest hurdle to jump, I think, for people is understanding that by recognizing and documenting a problem that may emerge, it may have not been predicted or it may have been predicted, that you need to document it, and by documenting it and then putting a plan together to fix it, you're not incriminating yourself, but rather you're actually meeting the requirement.
Yes, exactly. That activity itself is evidence of you being cGMP compliant. So that's, where it seems though, oh my God, we can show no one our dirty business. Well, obviously you don't want to, but at some point, if you acknowledge where the problems are at and how big they are, you can start solving them.
Absolutely. So, yeah, you mentioned a couple of things. I might go off script a little bit here and talk about. You mentioned a couple of items that really stood out to me, which is this idea of external, uncontrolled external inputs coming into a process, right? And the need to, on a per process basis, have some level of detailed documentation showing that you can basically trace when something happened back to a product. Would you say that we're heading more and more towards a sort of environment where intermediate testing, intermediate analytical results, or other types of in-process or sample-based testing on a batch basis midstream is going to become normalized?
Completely. 100%. Like when you think of other areas that require GMP, well, let's just say other industries, food, dietary, pharma, the expense of third-party testing for in-process testing is really high. And then the other aspect is each time that you have some type of a test for an in-process specification, you have to develop a test method for it that adequately measures it. And then if you're not measuring the uncertainty in your measurements in the laboratory, then you're in a whole nother realm of problems. So I personally think that if I had a manufacturing operation, one of the first things I would write out is the actual flow chart of unit operations, and then what are the control points? Where would things possibly not be traceable or adulterated or mixed up? And then I would put in the QC checkpoints to make sure that that's been done properly. So internal QC might be physical verification or visually verifying that something has happened, has a reaction completed or not. And that's where the FDA can't be prescriptive of you shall follow this control point. They can't right now because they don't have enough information. Maybe one day they'll say, oh my God, test for this, and then we'll know. But I personally think that it's a very valuable thing to be doing internally. I think what's underappreciated for a lot of this is that QC doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have a $50,000 HPLC. Some of those tests may be very qualitative, and when we look at test methods and what's required for in-process testing, at least at Orion, we usually try and think through what does it look like in developing countries that wouldn't necessarily have these tools. And it's funny because things like thin layer chromatography can give you qualitative and quantitative results depending on how you run it. So I think that if manufacturers remain flexible and don't over-engineer their QC checkpoints in the first place, or do a good job of identifying where they're at, then they'll know how much detection or testing or QC is really required to verify they're good to go for that particular step.
So here's a follow-up question. If you're aware that there could be a quality issue, let's take a common one from food products and food oils, like basically a fungal-derived toxin, right, a mycotoxin.
Right.
If you go in and you implement a filtration system at a midpoint in your process or at the end of your process that is proven from existing industry to be able to remove mycotoxins of the class that you're concerned about, at that point, do you need upstream testing for that potential adulterant, or is that an effective way to avoid the testing if you put in a remediation step?
Yeah, downstream controls are a reasonable thing to implement. If you know that that is a common adulterant in the raw materials, and then you know that you have a process that specifically removes it, you could potentially get by with that in-process testing. But it also begs the question of why one would not do it up front. And it's really a challenge, like the cost benefit analysis. I guess if we could just expand this to, how do we look at biomass going into a facility or into an extraction system? If it's not to spec, or it, in many ways, right? It could be yeast and mold, it could be pesticides, who knows? But those are the two big ones when we think of extraction systems, of how do we control those materials going in. Generally, our recommendation from past projects is developing a really strong QC system for those materials that go into the extraction system, because if you contaminate your extraction system and then you find that it carries through to the next batch, well, you've got bigger problems then. And that would be a case for very likely discarding a batch and calling it non-conforming for the subsequent batch if it were contaminated from a previous one. The difficulties for your specific question there with mycotoxins is that they're so dilute in something like hemp biomass that you might not see it, or it might be localized to one area of 100 bales of hemp. How are you possibly going or adequately going to sample that and know whether or not there's contamination? So it's so difficult to give you a straight answer. I can describe the situation and say, best case scenario is you catch it upstream. If you know you have a control or a process that removes it, it would, I'd say, be adequate to test the substance thereafter and understand its efficacy. And then, as I made the point earlier, it depends on the dose form. I mean, mycotoxins are bad no matter what for humans or mammals, so let's not get those on them. But when you think of it being an intermediate substance, for example, you just purified it and it's like, we've got like 10 parts per million of this mycotoxin, or whatever the spec would be. It might be that you then dilute it down into something else that has no concern for it. Or that the finished product, it would never show up in those trace quantities. But those are all risks that the manufacturer would have to evaluate, because it comes down to product liability after that. You send the product out the door and it's not to spec, or it turns out that those mycotoxins at that level and that dose form are in fact harmful, there's nothing to really do.
Well, and that's a big point to make, is that GMP, a lot of people think of it as being a federal regulation compliance issue, something that you have to do to operate to appease the government, right? But at the end of the day, there's another two primary parties to be concerned about, right? And one of them is your insurance company, and the other one is your customers' attorneys, right? Because at the end of the day, if you're selling to a manufacturer that is manufacturing an end consumer product, and then they have an issue with the product due to your ingredient is traced as being the source of an adulterant, that could come back to haunt you. On the flip side, if that same thing happens, your general liability insurance, which every company should have, and it's probably required to have according to their business license, depending on the state and the jurisdiction, then you might find your insurance company starts to come down on you and put a lot more scrutiny on you. Whereas if you just have a good quality assurance program up front, and you can avoid those potential issues, that's the investable company. That's the company that has a long-term,
right.
Positive lifetime ahead of it of
right.
reduced liability and reduced cost accordingly downstream.
Right. And this is a tangent slightly, but there are a lot of businesses that have an expectation of being bought. And really, how do you know whether a business is good or not? If you're about to spend millions of dollars acquiring a brand and they have great brand presence, but you don't know of the quality of their manufacturing, you might be buying something that's not manageable. So one needs to be careful on maintaining good records. It's like, there's a marina down the street for me for sale. And well, I asked the owner, well, is this a profitable marina for sale? Oh, I don't have any books on it. Well, okay, it's real estate then. It's not a marina. Same thing here. If you don't have those books, and when someone goes in to acquire a company, they're going to send someone like myself out there along with one of their executives that's going to go and negotiate with those owners. And then I'm going to be sitting there looking through the books and telling them whether or not it's an operation that has control or one that is, inadequately prepared for a transfer of ownership and transfer of operations. So those things, a good system in a business should be transferable to other hands. It should be authored, and then someone should be able to sit there, read through the requirements, the SOPs, and recreate the process themselves. So it's the more I don't like overly complicated documentation, let me tell you, or to have stacks and stacks of compliance paperwork, but those things are just baseline requirements. All said.
Great. Well, these are the things that keep the business owners up at night, right? Is how do we make our businesses adaptable, right? Because not the other side of what you just said is not only is it that you want it to be able to transfer the QC program if the company is sold and there's new staff coming in or something like that, but what happens if for whatever reason you have to change your QC staff over? Well, if your processes aren't easily trained into your new staff, your new employees, you're going to have a big headache on your hands and potentially decline in quality of your product while you have an intermediate change of hands. So you want to avoid that. Have robust documentation, and that's what it's all about from regulatory side all the way through operations side is documentation at the end of the day, right?
It's the proof of what was done. I'll put it to you that way. I think that we're going to cover this in length here in some of the upcoming questions, though.
Great. Well, let's go on then to the next point here, which is, I'd like to basically discuss raw materials, equipment, and processing, starting with a big question that we as equipment providers hit up against all the time, and we end up taking a pretty conservative viewpoint at Sci-Fi Systems about what qualifies here. But is there a definition of sanitary for hemp processors? I don't think that officially on a basis of FDA or a regulatory body that's been defined yet. But are there other definitions of sanitary out there? Is ASTM working on something, or what can we look to for a definition of sanitary in this industry?
Yeah, it's really an interesting trail of crumbs that's left behind as you try and investigate this, because we started off from the pharmaceutical perspective at Orion, and I had to ratchet it back down, like how can we justify this from literally small businesses that are trying to move into the space. And when you think of we'll take equipment for example, really you have to ensure, and this is I'm somewhat quoting FDA guidelines here, the surface needs to be cleanable. It shouldn't be additive to the substance of the product that's being made. And then when you clean it, there should be a quantifiable amount of the detergent that was used or absence of it. Because if you clean it and then you leave behind a detergent or a cleaning solution, that would be bad. Or if the product contact surfaces, and this is where it's very important to think of what is a product contact surface? The rest of it, you can justify some things, but for the product contact surfaces, you'd want to consider what is the surface roughness, for example, and its ability to pass a solvent over it, and for the extract to not adhere to it, and then for it to be cleaned afterwards. So those are the considerations there. And as I ratcheted back down from pharma to food and looking at dairy and the brewing industry, a lot of those components are being used in cannabis extraction systems. At the end of the day, if it were pharma, we would go in and verify, does it meet sanitary standard specifications that other standard bodies have written? And I almost hesitate to push it out there because it is a challenging requirement to meet if you are looking at the system through and through. And even then, there are so many dependencies of what are you using it for? How do you clean it? And these things can be justified. there's nothing stopping someone from manufacturing their own extraction system, getting a stainless steel welder like I tried the first time. Not good at welding stainless steel. That's why you guys are doing the equipment these days. But you should be able to construct something that's still safe, smooth, cleanable, and doesn't, impart anything onto the substance. So if you were really trying to twist my arm and like, what's the standard, Andrew? I'd say 3A sanitary standards are a really good place to start. And any time that a company is looking to, evaluate this or evaluate equipment, they need to do their due diligence in that and buy a copy of the standard and verify that it meets their requirements. The complexity in it is when someone says, oh, do you meet 3A standards? And it's like, that's a very big ask. Like, at that point, I would ratchet it up in the other direction and say, will you please show me your approved user requirement specifications and why it is that you need this standard? And they should be able to answer that and say, yes, we know exactly what we want to make, and we know that it's going into this dose form. We know it's going in as a food, therefore these requirements shouldn't be so stringent, versus a dietary ingredient versus an active pharmaceutical ingredient. So those are the complexities there, the different tiers, and then how do you make the justifications backwards from that? And that's why I put strong emphasis on what is the product contact surface, so that we're not, and the user of those equipment systems really needs to think through that as well of, hey, we want the 3A standard and we want the highest grade of stainless steel. And it's like, are you sure you need that? Because it's smooth, cleanable, has a similar surface roughness, and we've got a validated method for this for what you're trying to make. That's, you just don't want to overcomplicate life. So that's why I hesitate to just say, follow 3A.
Right. Yeah. And for reference of the crowd, 3A is commonly cited in food, especially in dairy industry, as being their sort of go-to surface standard. Obviously, there is a lot of concern there about buildup of contaminants, and so it's a pretty good go-to food type regulation. It also has levels that go up into even more stringency. BPA would be another one that would be much more stringent that we've seen some requests coming in for. And just be prepared that if you want really stringent standards, that's going to force the manufacturers of your equipment and your integration of your facility to go to pretty strong lengths of sourcing more expensive components, and spending more time in finishing the components. And so there's a price to be paid, but in the long run, you have a facility that is really, world class in terms of its standards and future compliance for anything that's going to be thrown at us by the regulatory bodies. So it's a give and take. It's how much do you want to spend versus what's practical to get to market, and how long are you going to operate this facility as it is? That's the other
Right. And a lot of these things are traditionally learned at smaller scales in other industries. So my background is as a biochemist and then analytical chemist. And when I start thinking of scaling up a process, the first thing I think is, how can we do this at the microgram scale? And then the milligram scale, and then the gram scale, and then a kilogram, anywhere in between. But what's the smallest way that you can start demonstrating what your process needs? And when you go through that product development cycle, you're going to identify, oh, actually, when we scale this up in the future to 10,000 kilograms of substance production a day, we know that we're going to need 3A stainless, or meet 3A specs for pharmaceuticals, because we're trying to get it into the EU, into Australia, into Asia. Those are the things that need to be considered there. But on the front end, it's always recommended to just know the process, scale it up, have a good laboratory notebook that documents all the lessons learned. And this is just general practice. As scientists, I think we take it for granted that everything's written down. There's not much that I don't do without writing it down. I've got a dozen notebooks sitting on my desk at all times. So I don't think about it, but when I'm doing something new, it might be working on a boat or working on a piece of wood or a woodworking project. I've got my notebook out and I'm thinking through, oh my God, wow, I just learned a lesson today. Don't use the chisel in this fashion or I might lose my finger. In the case of a business, it's like, oh my God, let's not go down this extraction pathway because when we scale up, it's just not going to work. So those are, it's a lot of just, learning at a small scale and then scaling it up that prevents those errors.
Oh yes, I remember when we started off selling equipment into the hemp industry, our first thing that we would pitch would be a pilot plant. And man, the days when people would move on a pilot plant, I like to think that they never came, but they're not yet here. It's sort of funny because if you're going to build a 50,000 pound a day plant, just for the purposes of quality testing of test batches of giant lots of biomass, you probably want the capability to simulate the run that you're doing at a huge, massive scale. But
yes. It's so painful to even think about the money that can be wasted if you don't have the chemistry worked out far upstream in your development process. Like when you go and buy a system and someone says, this is a supercritical CO2 reactor, okay, that's good. Tell me more about how it makes a product for me. Well, you put the stuff in, then something comes out. Okay. Can you tell me more about what happens there and in between in the chemistry of it? It really depends on the biomass that goes in. I agree with that, but we need more. And massive systems are being sold without the appropriate scale up and validation of bench work to the next scale. And when you see systems that go out and they've never operated before, they've not had any type of, I mean, it's like this is giving away the industry secrets, but you don't see adequate proof that a lot of systems will produce a product as the client imagines. There's this most beautiful cartoon that shows like what the client pictures, what the consultant pictures, and what the client actually receives at the end of the day, and often those things are mismatched. So the due diligence on the front end to say, how do we know this system is going to produce this substance to these specifications, is the right question to be asking. And then it becomes a much more harmonious narrative, and you don't see people like myself coming in after the fact to figure out, all right, what is this system? How do we characterize it? How do we make this demonstrate some form of GMP compliance?
Right, and one thing to point at there is that there are certain techniques that are starting to come into the hemp space, starting to come into the cannabis space that have a minimum viable scale that is at the moderate production scale of the process as it exists today, right? So your pilot facility may be the size of a production facility, but when you go into that type of an environment, and of course the industry itself needs to propel research and development into these processes that are common to other industries or have just emerged in other industries, because obviously that's how efficiencies are gained. But they need to understand how to grasp that. What are the things to really be looking for to validate before and after they bring the equipment in. And so we always recommend, that clients don't go it alone. This is what consultants are for, right? This is what, even if you have a quality assurance manager, you need somebody that's double checking their work, right? And that's where Ryan GMP comes in, right? It's like, you always need more minds than just one, because you can get trapped in loops or blind spots.
And the funny thing is, when people think of GMP and how does this relate to a facility, I think that it just looks overly complex. And our clients are usually astounded when I can write back a one-line email that says, yes, it's justified for these reasons to use this epoxy on the floor. And they're like, oh, okay, I think our questions are done now. Okay, great. And again, back to the case in point with the FDA and the quality review on CBD that they're soliciting for, we've been working on a really cool project with a group called Save the Terps. It's more cannabis focused, but with that, we started investigating critical quality attributes. And what we found in general was that cannabis flower that's sold in many different jurisdictions is below a lower specification limit from a test method and specification prescribed by ASTM. Okay, fine and well. What does that have to do with a facility? Well, when we started looking at that and saying, wait a second, you mean that there is lower terp potency with this lower water activity? Well, there are a lot of problems with that. Where do we find the root cause to go back to fix that in the production system? And you might not know it on the front end, but your water content's going to be very important for the quality of the extracts that come out at the end of the day. So then while you may say, hey, you know, it doesn't seem like drying is that important to us, well, it turns out it really will be once you start making a product, and you have to focus your efforts on drying all your hemp flower, for example, to specification in the first place. So those are the things that when you put together a good process map and say, well, we have to dry the biomass, and then the biomass comes in the facility, how do we know it meets that spec, and so forth and so on, all those things add up over time. So it's, again, look at what the quality of the product needs to be, and then determine all those steps backwards that ensure that quality. And it's almost like when you go about that paradigm of thinking, like you don't need a consultant. That's the beauty of it. Like you need an FTE that very likely was the quality assurance manager from the local hot dog factory. Because I promise you they're dealing with more complex problems than we would be with biomass that comes in. And there are so many professionals in, you know, various industries that just, oh yeah, this is how these things go together. 12-step unit operations, okay, control points, yeah, let's go back to that drying question, because it turns out, you know, in the case with Save the Terps, found people prefer cannabis that's within 0.55 and 0.65 water activity levels. So those are how, you know, how to think about it. And that's really where, like, as strategic advisors, we just tell people how to think. And we're always, I haven't gotten on the phone where I'm just like, God, these people just don't know how to think. It's like, well, no, they've probably taken steps before they knew they needed to think a certain way. So that's where the fun part of strategic advising comes in, where we're able to say, okay, yeah, we get what you're trying to make here. Here are where some of the dependencies are. You should form committees within your company so that you can start working on this problem, you know, from scratch, people looking at it on the ground, and then developing the controls to it. So that's, you know, how it works over time, and works theoretically in a company that you walk into and has been operating for 20 years. And it's like, why does this operate so well? Oh, because we had 20 years to think through how to think and our process for adding new equipment, because we saw what failure looks like, and then we added up the costs for not doing sufficient product development and then design in the facility, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why, you know, just training oneself to think a certain way and ask the right questions and always focus on the specs, you can avoid those problems in your facility design, and have literally the report to say to the FDA, should they come in and audit you, hey, here are justifications, and they'll be like, yeah, your justifications for this line item make no sense and it's not scientifically founded. Oh, you're right. We can't argue with that. Or you can argue with them and, you know, prove to them how they're wrong. And if you use science to do that, they're going to have to back down. You can put that plexiglass box around something rather than $1 million structure. So it's again, it's a way of thinking more than being prescribed about, you shall have this, you know, FRP panel over all surfaces and you shall clean it 5 times a day. No, it's in proportion to the risk.
Right. So it's a process of internal development. Here's a question about internal development. That's something that on an ingredient side, we don't see as much of this as we would expect necessarily. So just maybe a quick answer here, but shelf stability testing. I know that on the you know, especially the food product side, the hemp industry's come a long way. Shelf stability testing for hemp consumer products is definitely common. People are taking this from standard food industry. What we see less often is ingredient manufacturers of crude oil, distillate, even isolate products that actually have an answer to, okay, well, how long will this C of A test results remain valid? Or how long can we store this crude oil on a shelf before there's some risk of there being degradation? Is that something that you view as sort of a minimum requirement for having an ingredient business, or is this sort of way that people are approaching it, that as long as we can move it off the shelf fairly quickly, we don't need to worry about it?
The latter is our current standard practice in the industry. The former depends on who your customer is. So if you're selling an active pharmaceutical ingredient and you've got a prime contract with a pharmaceutical company, they're probably going to, if you have a prime contract with a pharmaceutical company as an API supplier, you've got stability data most likely. If it is, and I hate to put constraints out there because I've totally advised people that they should, in fact, do stability further upstream with intermediates, but it was more in specific use cases of, well, who do you want your customers to be? Because when you're trying to go to a global CPG firm and you're not actually manufacturing the finished product, they're going to ask you, how long will it be good for? Now, it also depends on having a customer that's providing specifications for that intermediate substance. Like, you would want a prime contract, let's say with, like, I don't know, any global CPG firm. Like, let's say Coca-Cola wants to buy CBD and CBDA mixtures from you to be able to put in their drinks, not just decarboxylated CBD, let's say. It's 2019. But they're going to tell you exactly what the concentrations of CBD and CBDA should be in that intermediate substance. And then you're going to have to manufacture to those specifications and then have an adequate sampling plan to say, yeah, we sampled this. We know that overall this batch is of this quality. And very likely, if you get to that point and you're showing, your quality specs over time and your product quality reviews show this, it might be sufficient to get by. And I would approach it that way first, of demonstrating, hey, out of these last 10 batches, all of them have been to spec. And then, of course, set aside reserve samples, 3, 6, 9 months, 12 months. I mean, the stability programs are out there, and it's like free reading for anyone who's interested in ICH guidelines. My favorite reading, by the way. But nonetheless, if you follow a pathway like that and you can demonstrate that you stored your materials in the same way, or your samples for stability in the same way that you store your materials, you can show that data to the customer and say, hey, does this fit your requirements? And if it's adequately constructed against ICH guidelines, no one would have an issue. But I'll just round back up and say it depends on who your customer is and what jurisdiction you're in.
Great. Well, maybe let's move on to something that you've pointed at quite a few times in our conversation already, which is thoughts on control points and how to make a control point plan. I'm not going to get into too much detail here. We're pretty time constrained. But one thing that I did want to touch on, at least here, is the idea of sampling and quarantine, because this is something that is very uncommon to see a really robust plan up front, at least from the clients that we've been dealing with, which is, sometimes there's a good quarantine plan for the biomass coming in,
right,
because you want to validate the COAs that you got when you bought it. You're going to take additional random samples, have them third-party validated, because you don't want to either maliciously or accidentally get sold the wrong hemp that's way below what you paid for in terms of concentration of target, right? So that's right, fairly common. Also, there's the risk of mold growing over time, and so you want to isolate that from your existing storage facility. What you don't see as often is something like after crude oil is produced and you're going to distill it, but you're not just continuously passing all of your crude oil production through to distillate on a continuous basis where you're sort of treating it as a single process, fully integrated. that material is batched and handled in such a way that that you keep batches separate from each other as a matter of course when waiting for intermediate testing. Because I think it goes back to this intermediate testing question we covered earlier, which is it's probably advisable that, be it qualitative or otherwise, that you have intermediate samples for your different processes, right? But does that mean that you actually need to hold back those batches of material from the next stage in the process and quarantine them? Or is it enough to just be able to associate the sample and test results with a batch even after the batch has gone down the process line, you know, into different derived ingredients downstream?
Yeah, good question. Very good question. How do you want to handle that? It could be done either way, where it can be an economic constraint to sit on product while it is, you know, in quarantine. And the longer it sits there, the less value it's generating, it's taking up floor space, things like that. So every manufacturer has the incentive to move products through as quickly as possible. And it also depends on what's being made. You know, if it's a critical step where you know there's an adulterant or something, an impurity that needs to be removed, you'll probably want to characterize that sample and know just how difficult that's going to be for the next step that'll be in the process. If you know, and also, you know, sampling and testing can be reduced over time. So if you've got a good log of all of these samples and you start out and you're like, you know what, for our first 1,000 units of this intermediate substance we're going to produce, we're going to sample X%. Or a very good number for sampling, like let's say we're in any situation. If you're like, Andrew, come up with a sampling plan right now, I'd be like, square root of n+1. That many samples. And, you know, it's a tough one because there are a million different ways to sample and choose how many samples to take. And, you know, my fear with a lot of standards that are being written is that they're prescribing a specific way to do sampling and suggesting that it be done all over the place when, again, it just comes down to what is the risk of that material being held in that location. And, you know, I immediately think to myself, well, what's the cost of literally having something sit in quarantine? I don't have any issue with batch splits and then having part of a batch go on to one downstream product and another. That's exactly what it's supposed to do. Like, it would be unreasonable to expect that 100% of an intermediate goes into like one downstream product. Maybe it's the case, but again, you would set up your sampling program, do something rigorous like the square root of n+1, literally graph the data for what it is you're measuring, and then show whether or not there's a change, and define what a tolerable percent change is that does not affect that process downstream. So the approach there is observe until you feel confident. And again, this comes down to statistics and saying, well, it looks like on average, this is the amount of variation we see in this substance. And if you get some indicator that it might not be in spec, well, then you'll know. And let's say you've got those products in quarantine, you're like, oh my God, it didn't meet this spec. This happened 3 times to us. What's going on upstream? And you bring up this question of like, well, what about if there are mycotoxins? Well, if we observe mycotoxins in a downstream product that's supposed to remove it, we now know a root cause to one of our problems in processing. So it depends, again, like, do you have a customer that wants to know all these things? And if yes, yeah, dive into it because it's written into your contract and quality agreement. And it's not to say, oh yeah, just go ahead and sell things without, you know, doing testing. You might be able to get away with that. And you might find, you know, if you get that contract with Coca-Cola, all they want is to know that you've met their specifications that they wrote into their user requirements and that you deliver it. And then then it's your business's risk if you want to, you know, do the due diligence or not and make sure that you're compliant all the time to meet that, you know, agreement.
Yeah, so it all comes down to the specifics once again. but that's no surprise, because that's really, again, that's what it's about, is suiting your specific goals. And the FDA is going to be general enough in terms of their requirements that as long as you can justify you're meeting those goals to an extent that allows for the product to be considered safe, you're probably good. Now that said, one piece of this that before we go to questions, which please everyone submit questions to the Q&A module or the chat module. Now we are going to start taking questions here in just a few moments. But let's talk a little bit about cleaning and sanitation. You brought it up a couple times here. We always build our equipment to be compatible with clean in place modules. We don't typically provide our, a clean in place solution to the client, but it always has the spray balls or is capable of being fully filled and drained within a certain amount of time to be able to be cleaned effectively in place. But the flip side of that is understanding what is the range of clean in place that's possible here. When we've seen a lot of different approaches hinted at, sometimes we don't even know what our clients end up picking, but as something that's sometimes left to the very last minute for a lot of clients, it would be good to address how do we think about clean in place, and is this something where again, we might come to a standard industry solution that this is what works, we're just going to go with this, or is this again something that you're basically on your own, you're going to have to find something that works for you, or find a salesman that can make a convincing argument that you should go with their solution.
So are you saying that the clean in place systems would be separate, and that's what is attempting to be sold and how to select that? Is that correct?
Yeah, correct. So both from the perspective of what type of detergents are you using, right? And then therefore what type of actual clean in place infrastructure. So tankage, pumps, is it a mobile cart? Is it a built-in system where it's piped from the primary storage to the other location? Is this something where there's going to be essentially an industry standard that we see, this product CIPX becomes the one thing, and the FDA just said, oh, that's acceptable and it's cheap, so everybody just says, yes, that's it. Or is it really going to continue to be this, sort of plucking from the ether what you come in contact with, what you think is best out of an ever-growing set of options? Because it really is a labyrinth out there to some extent.
Yeah, I mean, I think why it raises a question mark in my mind is because there's no one-size-fits-all answer for cleaning. Like, again, back to Dr. Deming, are we eating food on this table, or are we manufacturing some sort of chemical? Because the chemical reaction could potentially go sideways with, an unclean table. Clean in place, it's a very big segment of GMP for large-scale processing, and it becomes absolutely necessary. Like, you can't send human beings inside some of these pipes and systems and, make sure they're safe while they're cleaning. It's not the scale, right? And there's nothing in between. So usually clean in place will be applied in specific systems that are difficult to clean. So if it's not something that can be disassembled or would be too time consuming to disassemble, you'd want to have clean in place. When I think of clean in place, I start thinking about, like, what's the cost benefit analysis between a new piece of equipment, and it's not just, setting that piece of equipment in there. It's then, figuring out what is the cleaning solvent or detergent, and what is the substance that's being cleaned. How dirty is this piece of equipment from its processing? And then how do we make sure that the detergent is removed by adequate rinsing? So the question, while seeming general, I'm sorry, we're back to the specifics again of, like, what are you trying to accomplish? So the issue with clean in place systems is that often when you use that terminology, then you're setting yourself up for an FDA auditor to ask, where is the validation package for this cleaning process? And it's not as though you may have a human physically inspecting it afterwards, but usually clean in place means the system is kept sealed, right? So how do you inspect it? How do you know it's clean? Do you have to go in there and like physically swab something and then send that down to the QC laboratory? If you've got clean in place, it's like buying a robot. You want to make sure it does the same thing every time. So you need to validate that your clean in place robot is actually working every time. So that becomes a whole study in itself. And then before you know it, you're in a whole, process development situation of what are we trying to make? How do we make sure that it's not adulterated, not mixed up, and that it's traceable, and then that all of these other requirements have been met. So I'd say there's a list of things that need to be considered there. If you can do it manually, whew, I'll do it manually.
Yeah, so call your consultant, in other words.
Yeah.
Yeah, so been prepared to do some sampling, some surface sampling at a minimum to validate your clean in place procedures. And maybe moving forward, something we've definitely been looking at is that perhaps more and more equipment providers will step up and just provide this as a stock answer. That's something that we would like to do. But at the same time, what we found is that you're dealing with big tanks, you're dealing with constant detergent supply. You're talking supply chains that oftentimes are regionalized. So at this point, we've typically deferred to regional providers of these systems because they're going to have the long-term relationship with the client. We're nationwide. But moving forward, perhaps we'll be looking at standard validated system solutions for this, because as it is right now, everybody out there, especially if you're buying equipment from multiple providers that have a clean in place option,
Yes.
just expect to do some validation in-house to find the right solution.
Yeah, you called it there too. And it's really an issue because in a lot of cases from facilities that we've seen, you see multiple brands of equipment that have been put in sequence of one another that neither manufacturer had intended that it necessarily plug and play like an API for software into the other unit. So cleaning, again, not to mention, like, we generally got complicated systems with cannabis. Like, you think of the solvent swaps required for doing CO2 extraction and then going into winterization for a lot of products. Complexity goes up as you swap solvents and then look at them. You're cleaning with CO2 in one, and then next one it's theoretically a methanol wash, or someone's using a detergent between line clearances, and all these things. When I look at it, I think, oh my God, line clearance costs money. How can we reduce the amount of time that it takes to turn over a system from being contaminated to being within specification and ready for the next use? So operational expenses need to be carefully considered against, automated equipment. I'm from Detroit, so I've seen like the automotive industry. I've always watched it and I've worked in it. They've made some terrible mistakes, terrible blunders. And one of them back in the 80s, GM tried automating everything. And then what did they have to do? They had to throw away all their automated systems. And when I couldn't believe it, because this was like before Tesla that I became aware of it. Then Elon Musk is like, we're going to automate everything. And then quality was just, it started down here. And now it's going up after they ripped out Elon rolled up his sleeves and ripped out all the automated systems. And they went back to humans doing a lot of the work. So I always caution people of going up to the next more complicated step before you've reviewed all your options for doing things in the simplest fashion.
Yeah, but also, of course, don't be afraid to take the step when it just becomes totally impractical and you need 40 people
Right.
on a factory floor just to man these little operations that you're doing constantly, because then your
Exactly.
documentation, again, you've got to
Yes.
know who was where or when, and it becomes very complicated.
Yeah, you're weighing out the risks there, where if it's 40 different people that need to be trained to do one specific thing, and then it's like, well, the variation now is going to come from people being inside this vessel. It's like, oh, we can't have that. Let's, ante up to clean in place. So it all needs to be evaluated in, like, a phrase we use, the cost to quality. Like, how do you know how much something is going to cost based on the investment you're putting in, and how big of a problem is it solving?
Great. Absolutely. Well, I think we should try and take some questions from the audience right now. First one, we already have a little backlog here, is How do ISO 9001 and GMP relate to one another?
It's a good question. There are a lot of people that look at ISO 9001, and I've got colleagues in the industry who have been promoting that, and outright, I would have to ask them, have you ever seen any product for human consumption manufactured under an ISO 9001 certification? And I have not audited any facilities that are ISO 9001 compliant for making products for human consumption for their manufacturing operations. Now, if you're looking to be ISO 9001 compliant, I mean, maybe you could look upstream and say, well, our equipment manufacturer who procures all of these materials and puts them together, they might need, you can have a requirement for ISO 9001 of your vendors. But for the most part, manufacturers of hemp and cannabis substances and the downstream products doesn't really apply. And I've seen it applied for things like customer service. Like, for example, an LP in Canada that I had worked with set up ISO 9001 systems to make sure that each time one of their representatives got on the phone and a medical patient contacted them to purchase cannabis, that was handled in an appropriate fashion. And they dovetailed their GMP recall systems into an ISO 9001 system. So it's okay for business management practices and ensuring customer service, but it is not applicable for manufacturing of human consumption products.
All right. Well, so just saw a fresh one come in. How long a time should the GMP implementation take for a cannabis company? Let's take a specific scenario here. You've got an already operating facility, been producing some products, and they want to go to cGMP. They're transitioning from perhaps a food or perhaps an unregulated market, like one of the adult use markets that hasn't really implemented GMP, although they probably should have. And then now they want to go to cGMP. They want to be producing nutritional supplement products. Is there a rule of thumb on timeline for making that implementation possible?
You know, I've seen miracles happen. Like when you have an entire company that turns to and they're like, we're not going to have our next contract if we don't do this. I've seen them turn it around from a state compliant hemp program into one that's compliant with food in a relatively short amount of time. If we're going from, assuming you've got food compliance and you're going up to dietary supplement GMP requirements, what you're adding to that are validation studies and demonstrating, like when you say you've got a risk control, like we must clean this system after this step, then you would have to validate it and show it multiple times over. So that's where things take more time than people expect. And we mentioned critical control points a few times. From my perspective, when we go in and advise people, we're not looking to shuffle paperwork. Like that stuff's almost free on the internet. Like if you hire a consultant to get you GMP compliant, you didn't adequately search the internet for GMP SOPs. Sorry. It's a very expensive mistake to pay a lot of money for paper. You're looking for the advice on what is that process, what are the quality parameters, and the critical control points required to ensure you've got a safe product. And when we say, hey, we need a control plan, it's like, what are the specifications? And I can assure you in the CPG world, they've assumed that you've got the GMP compliance down. They just want to know you meet specs. So again, defining those specs, making sure that you are adequately meeting them for what the product type is, you'll then determine the timeline. For a pharmaceutical GMP implementation and give a runway of 2 years. Because very likely, like each time that you come up with a control point, then you have to have a test method. Like if you say, oh my God, pesticides and raw materials or biomass is such a big problem, we have to do internal QC, we want to run this from start to finish, make it a pharma product, you're going to test those to the very end. And the first thing you do is say, well, we've got control over our hemp supply, we grow it ourselves, and this is an ideal case for vertical integration, but you grow the cannabis or the hemp in the fields, and then you dry it and you test it. And when you test it at that point, you're going to develop a very specific test method for your raw materials. You might find in your testing upstream that some varieties are resistant completely to different pathogens and others are completely susceptible to it. So, you know, in those scenarios, you'd start dialing in of how many controls you need downstream. And it's in proportion to the amount of time it takes, really.
Right, but I don't want to scare people off because you just mentioned pharma timelines. If we're talking about nutritional supplement and food industry, do you think it's a matter of months, not weeks, but
yeah.
months, not
An
years?
aggressive timeline, 90 days. Like if we went in and started with an audit, and we've been doing all this remotely since, where please give us answers to these questions. You can either tell us the truth over a conference call or not. We can physically go verify it if you want, but you know, that's where you're able to see, you know, where you stack up. But
All right.
really, organizations are more prepared than they give themselves credit for, I would say.
Great. Well, I just saw another question come in. For an edible facility, FSMA and GMP regulations should be implemented? Question mark. I'm going to assume that this person is talking about a recreational cannabis, regulated cannabis facility in a state that has a regulations for that, where again perhaps GMP hasn't been a state requirement yet or is loosely implemented. What do you think?
Yeah, if it were my business, that's a great question. If I had my own operation, what would I do today? And I'll respond from that perspective. I would basically get a checklist. These are widely available online, and start working from there towards Part 111 compliance. And I think that as we read the tea leaves of what's going on across cannabis and what appears to be most applicable, dietary supplement GMP guidelines come up most frequently. I mean, I've been surprised in some cases where it's obviously a cosmetic product, but then I'm asked to audit it to dietary supplement GMP guidelines. And I can see why, because cosmetic guidelines are not as defined by the FDA. They give guidance, but not outright requirements. So I've kind of rolled back into dietary supplements as being the catch-all, where the level of complexity is not onerous for most manufacturers, but really it's on par for the product types that are going into the humans, and then gives you some assurance of protecting against liabilities with those product types.
And here's another point of view to keep in mind, of course, is that would you say that FDA is going to come down and enforce on these state-regulated companies? Potentially at some point in the short term, they may have more priorities towards regulating the hemp industry, which is under-regulated from their perspective by the states. But what does your insurance company think? And if you had an event where there was some sort of recall event, you have a food-based pathogen that gets into your food and goes out, and somebody gets sick after eating one of your brownies or whatever you've manufactured, is it going to take your business down entirely because all of your inventory needs to be thrown out because you don't have batch records? That is a risk that I would never take as a business owner, right? So you want to have at least a level of internal documentation and batch recording so that in the event of a recall, you can effectively recall a small batch and not your entire production that you've ever made ever, right? So that would be one thing that would point me towards GMP. And then again, you have a relationship with an insurance company, and you have a relationship with a landlord, and you have relationships with customers. They're all going to view you in a more favorable light if you can say, even if you haven't been GMP audited, if you can just say, we have put in a plan that we believe is conforming with GMP requirements, that goes a long way.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the misunderstanding with GMP is that, and I may have already said this, that people look at it as compliance and paperwork, when what it really comes down to and what the FDA cares about is that you're not harming people. And GMP is just a documentation of all the ways that we've found out since children were poisoned in like the late 1800s and early 1900s of ways not to do things, for sure, and things that you generally have to look out for without ever putting a constraint on any one business. And this is where, again, as a small business owner, my dad was a small business owner, like I look at regulations and I'm like, stay away, stay away. But also as a business owner looking forward and saying, how do I prepare for this? It really does, take time, but it's not as challenging as it looks and does protect from those liabilities. You don't have to be registered with the FDA. You certainly do not need a certification to be GMP compliant. Like that's a big misunderstanding. Like a certification, it's like it just doesn't hold its weight. What matters is that you meet the specifications and you can show your customer that you're meeting the specifications. And then once we have like well-defined product categories for, CBD supplements or food products or cosmetics or pharmaceutical ingredients, the FDA can weigh in a much more reasonable fashion. So I wouldn't be worried about it until we see what the FDA states from its quality review. All of what they've said over the past few years has been focused on how do we know that it's safe. And they're not asking like whether or not the facility is safe to manufacture, and they're assuming you're already meeting GMP requirements. They're asking, does this product meet our minimum safety requirements? So that's where manufacturers should focus on and ask themselves the questions: where do we have risks in our process? Where might the product become adulterated? What might affect its stability? And when you ask all those questions, a GMP facility just unfolds. It's kind of a funny thing. So it's just a lot of design work on the front end will lead you to a simplified, oh, yep, checking the box, checking the box, checking the box, checking the box. Come audit us, client. Like, we're here to serve you. I promise you we're doing the best job we can. If you have any concerns as a customer, tell us what we can improve. So.
Right. Well, here's one thing that I think is a hot button issue that goes along with the recent DEA announcements. And that is, you've talked a lot about adulterants and adulterants getting into product. So one thing that I'm going to highlight, because it's related to what we've been talking about, is if you have a process that is transforming what is in your base ingredient into something that is new through a method that isn't like growing a plant in soil, then you're going to have the burden on your company, to characterize what the things that you're not intending to produce are that might be in your product, and then prove that they're not in there.
Right.
So something to be very aware of. And right now, have you been talking to anybody that's doing that type of semi-synthesis product where they're going the distance to actually qualify what the byproducts are and how to avoid, how to prove that they're not in their product?
That stuff is easy. Chemists are doing that all over the world right now, right? Like that's so standard fare for anything that's going into a human. It obviously, like we wouldn't be making this stuff if it didn't change human physiology. So I'm agnostic as to whether it's synthetic, biosynthetic, or outright derived by plants. I mean, obviously, like 100% of our business is on the side of, advising people with, cultivating cannabis and hemp and downstream processing. But you're right. A synthetic route needs to be verified for all of its impurities. And why this is like a big issue, I beat my head up against the wall for at least a year once I left pharma and came into cannabis full time, of how do I make this justification of impurities, because that is always something that you call out in a drug product that you're making. And in this case with cannabis, like I think it's easier when we look at the product types, food and dietary supplements. Yes, of course, you want to know any impurities, but you're dealing with a botanical substance, and you can call that a compound drug because it's got a bunch of different active ingredient, classes in it. And then you further purify it and remove maybe the matrix that it was on in the first place, and go further downstream, it's like you're going to have series of impurities all the way along. And I think that it becomes incredibly difficult to start justifying what impurities might exist in a botanically derived product. Now, if you go in, and this is where it's like I feel comfortable saying keep it in the dietary supplement space, because the United States Pharmacopoeia, there are some amazing people there. Dr. Sarma has been taking the lead, and he's been very generous with sharing documentation across the board what they're working on. They're scientists, they publish. But isolate, for example, doesn't appear on the map of herbal dietary supplements. And that's one where you would start asking the question of how pure is this and what else is in it? Whereas the other substances that are produced, any intermediate before an isolate, or even if you were to say a distillate or purified fraction that contains other things, those are all compound drugs still. Might be a raw material for another process that further removes it, but one way or another, I'll revise that. There's no way to take a complex botanical and identify all the impurities and then still have a operable business.
Right. Yeah. And I was even thinking of folks that might be buying that botanical derived ingredient and then performing a reactive chemistry on it and then selling an ingredient following that, right? So then we get to this whole scenario where not only do the indulgents in the original ingredient that you're buying have to be known in terms of how they're reacting with the reactants that you're using, but also the actual reaction that you're doing might have secondary byproducts that you then have to characterize, and then you have to either prove that they're not in the final form that you're selling because they're removed, or alternately that those secondary byproducts are themselves safe. And that's really the FDA's push. Is we're seeing it for CBD right now, but everybody brace yourself, because you think you can semi-synthesize a new chemical and then not justify that it is safe for human consumption. Somebody's gonna spend some money to do some studies to prove that it's not toxic or harmful to humans at some point.
Right. I mean, it requires some knowledge of chemistry. We've got an amazing organic chemist that works with us, Dr. Yvonne Depore, and she really dives into those types of issues. And for myself, I of course see a lot of people asking about these, and usually when someone starts asking me about, hey, how do we transform CBD into THC? Like, we've got an article up on our website, Hemp Hacker, about that. I've been getting calls for years about that, and it's like, all right, well, do you have these things in place? And it's almost always no. Do you have a chemist? No. Okay, well, I'm sorry, we can't help you then. So those types of things, like, we definitely get asked about it, but I think generally the people that have the capabilities are just doing it, and they don't need to ask. And I don't mean to belittle anyone, but if they have to ask on how it's done, they may not be prepared to jump into that type of business. And it's to no discredit to anyone. It's limited knowledge in the industry right now. How do you do these things? Well, I don't know. There are maybe like a dozen people in the world that know how to do that right now in the industry that would do it as a service. So I think that it's a viable pathway, and I wouldn't hold anyone back from using a purified cannabis substance to do additional organic chemistry, because where did the raw materials come for organic synthesis? You know what I mean? Like, they came from somewhere. Someone either synthesized them, or they took them from some other product, purified them, and okay, now it's ready to go. So, it's completely doable, and I don't see any barriers to it. It's just that it's got more complexities baked into it.
Yeah. So, like you said, if you have to ask, maybe it's not the business for you. One thing to ask yourself is, do you know what a new dietary ingredient filing is, and are you doing it yourself? Right. Because if the answer is no, then hesitate to get into the business.
Yeah, and that's the scary part, because people can be asking questions where that there's a lot of complexity downstream, and they're like, right now, I look at the CBD market and that the FDA has asked these questions, and if you don't have some program to say, hey, we're meeting these specs, the FDA is going to tell you your business really soon. So it's like, if you're manufacturing right now, it's the opportunity to jump in and say, hey, we're a good player. We've got all these things. Everything the FDA asks for, it's like, yep, we've got specs on this, on this, on this, and this. This is all we make. So people should not worry so much. They just need to characterize their process and their product, and those things go hand in hand. If you have a specification for everything you touch, then you don't have that much to be concerned about.
Excellent. Well, Andrew, thank you so much for your time today and for shedding some light on GMP. I'm sure this is a topic we will be touching on for years to come. So perhaps we'll have you on Plants to Plants again sometime in the future. In the meantime, for all of those watching, you can find Orion GMP services. What's the best way to reach out to you?
Our website, oriongmp.com, or you can email myself, Andrew at OrionGMP, or info at OrionGMP. All those lead to the same space. So.
Excellent. So yeah, if you have concerns, if you need consulting to help you get through the process of bringing GMP into your facility or planning a brand new facility and new processes that are going to need to be GMP compliant, or that you want to be GMP compliant for any of the reasons we've talked about, reach out to Orion GMP. You can find this video in full on YouTube. Search for Sci-Fi Systems Plants to Plants, and you will find it there. Or go to our website, scifisystems.com, to find a complete list of our back episodes and future episodes. In the meantime, like us on Facebook, Instagram, and please contact us for any equipment needs that you might have in the processing space. Thank you all for joining us today, and we look forward to future episodes. Next up, we have an episode featuring conveying and biomass refinement in terms of drying, particle size reduction, classification. We have ABM Equipment Company with us, so please find us and find the announcement for that on our Instagram or on our website. That will be in 2 weeks' time at 11 Pacific time. Thanks again, Andrew, for joining us.
Thank you, Emmett.